Shareholder empowerment has become something of a hot topic in corporate governance. Research suggests that shareholder empowerment in the banking industry might have contributed to the weakening of banks prior to the crisis and eventually affected their ability to weather the storm. I'm with Dr. Tom Kirchmaier of the Manchester Business School and the London School of Economics. He is one of the authors of the report Shareholder Empowerment and Bank Bailouts. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Tell me a bit about your research.
So this is an ongoing project. We've worked on this for the better parts of 2.5, 3 years. And we were really interested to understand, how shareholder power affects bank stability. And there's no better way to measure it than over the financial crisis. So we had the big crisis. A lot of the banks needed to be bailed out and rescued by the state. And that obviously gives a very good indicator of whether or not a bank was really viable when it came under pressure. So we looked at about 270 US banks, collected a lot of shareholder rights data over a 5-year period, and then created a new index, which is, has about 9 dimensions, which are at times additive, at times mutually exclusive. And we then related this shareholder empower index to having received bailout money from the Treasury in the US. And what we find is quite startling. So the more shareholders were empowered in a particular bank, the more likely it was that it needed to be bailed out during the crisis. And the most conservative measure is, so if you were fully insulated from shareholder powers, you were 18% less likely to be bailed out. Statistically very significant. And if you then went further in refining this data, you actually come to a level of about 35% being less likely to be bailed out. Now, these are huge numbers.
This is something of an ongoing debate. There seems to have been 2 camps forming, some in favor of shareholder empowerment, some in favor of more insulation. Did you have any preconceptions? Were you expecting to find these results?
No, we were actually quite agnostic about it. We were really just interested to see what is happening. Clearly, we are aware of this debate. In the UK, for example, you're very much in the camp of the more shareholder are empowered, the better it is. And in fact, part of the debate during the financial crisis was actually we might actually have to empower them even further and get the bondholders involved too. In the US, you actually have more of a choice because individual companies have more rights to actually choose if they want to give shareholders more or less rights. So this gives us some variance which we could study. And then obviously the US is a big country, so it has more banks and more data, which is quite nice. And there, we found these really strong, startling results. And the more we thought about it, the more we thought, actually, this makes a lot of sense what we see in the data here. And banks might just not be normal firms. You have this huge moral hazard problem where you have the certainty almost that a bank will be bailed out when it gets into trouble. Because this is what we learned during the Great Depression, that it is just not a good idea for societies to let banks or go bankrupt, or be more precise, to allow depositors to have huge losses. Because then you impose a bank run and all these things are very, very unfavorable for a society. You see, you have very strong incentives in banking to increase risk above what is optimal for society. And again, this is where we're coming back to what we said in the very beginning. We are interested to create a system that is optimal for society and not optimal for particular shareholders.
Do you think the results suggest that if there hadn't been any shareholder involvement, these banks would have survived this crisis?
I would have thought we might have seen less of a crisis and less of a push for higher risk products. Clearly, a crisis of this magnitude has many culprits. Part of them are in politics, because there was this huge incentive to actually generate growth. In the US economy, which wasn't growing really well. There was obviously the interest of ordinary people to have their own house and not fully being aware of the costs that are implied in such a wish. And obviously you had the banks who wanted to make higher returns. So you had probably a cocktail, a potpourri of interest groups who were lethal when put together.
So how are they supposed to protect their interests?
The shareholders do what we want them to do, which is, they maximize the return, and this is, we're perfectly happy with them. The question is for us as a society who writes rules in terms of how we regulate banks, if we shouldn't actually kind of put the brake on shareholder rights in banks and find a more healthy role in this mix with regulators, bondholders, and so on.
How does the index apply when the majority shareholder is the government?
When the government owns a bank, it can dictate any terms, because obviously it has a very close link to the regulator, who can impose almost anything and everything. So I think the index doesn't really apply anymore if the government owns the bank. The big question is, are governments good shareholders of banks? I would have thought not, because you have all these political pressures, which then might lead politicians to put pressure on a bank to lend to projects which are not always the best ones.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.